Chip Dameron is the author of a travel book and 10 collections of poetry, including the latest, Mornings with Dobie's Ghost. His poems have appeared in literary publications around the country and abroad. A member of the Texas Institute of Letters, he's also been a Dobie Paisano Fellow. We have 2 Dobie Paisano Fellows in the house today. All right, well, welcome, Chip. Thank you.
Well, first I'd like to thank Julie and Fernando and all the folks at Malvern who invite writers to come and read from their works, and it's always a treat to have this opportunity. I'd like to also say, as a fairly recent Dobie Paisano Fellow, a couple of years ago was my time there. Lowell was there earlier and enjoyed his, I think, 5 months there. I had 4 months there. I would like to acknowledge and thank again 2 folks who made that experience the memorable one that it was. Michael Adams, who's the director of that whole effort, and then Bob Wolfkill, who works with Michael, and both of them were just a wonderful help and made that stay even more special. So just a little bit of background information about my new book, which is called Mornings with Dobie's Ghost. It's got a sequence of poems in here. When I started my 4 months at the ranch, which is located in southwest Austin, actually not too far from the Austin Zoo, if any of you have gone to the Austin Zoo out that way. I spent some time that summer doing some reading about Dobie and about the ranch, and ran into some experiences that some writers had had. And I just had noticed that both A.C. Green and drawing a blank, Gary Cartwright, who spent time at the ranch in the, I think it was the late 60s and 70s. They had mentioned having had experiences where they felt Dobie's ghost or spirit there. And I think other writers have commented on that as well. And when you're at the ranch, you do quickly sort of feel some sense of that. First of all, there's memorabilia of his on the walls and out and so on. There's a writing desk that he used, some boots that he had had, and so on. And so you feel, you kind of feel that spirit. It's a 250-acre ranch, which I guess in terms of Texas ranches is small. In terms of ranches near Austin, it's quite huge. I guess, and so one of the things that I thought about when I got there and started doing some work was sort of wondering and thinking, I wonder what Dobie's ghost or spirit might have to say to a visiting writer like myself coming for a few months and so on. And that ended up sparking the poems that constitute this collection. So I'll go ahead and read just a selection from these. And the sense is that these are sort of dialogues, or part of a dialogue, monologues, I guess, really, that Dobie's ghost is things that he's saying to a visiting writer who might be there early in the mornings, having a cup of coffee before the sun's come up out on the porch. And so the first one here is called Ranch Retreats, and I'll just mention a couple of characters or people that appear, or maybe several recur here. Dobie, and again, Dobie himself, for those of you, some of you are quite familiar with J. Frank Dobie, I suspect, I know, but others may be less familiar. He was born in 1888 on a small ranch between San Antonio and Corpus. Ended up going to Southwestern University in the early years of the 20th century and met a woman named Bertha McKee, a fellow student. They ended up getting married and lived their life together. Then he had a long stretch of time teaching at UT Austin, during which he wrote extensively about folklore. Much of it was primarily folklore of the Southwest, but also about he also weaves in history. He also weaves in the animals, the plant life, the culture of the area. And he became quite well known around the state. And really in the 40s and 50s into the early 60s, he was referred to as Mr. Texas. And he was, again, very, very well known. He died, he bought the ranch that's called Paisano Ranch. He bought that in 1959, late in his life, and spent time out there periodically, although he still kept his house in town, close to the, just on the edge of the UT campus now. And he had the ranch for 5 years, and then in 1964 he passed away. And several years after that, friends of his ended up raising money and purchasing the ranch from his widow and then basically deeding it over to be used as a writer's retreat. So at any rate, that's some background. I'm going to mention a couple of close friends of his that he was fond of. Walter Prescott Webb, who was a very well-known historian of the time, is one. And then he also, Roy Bedicek, who was, both of them were at the university in various capacities. He spent a lot of time with them. And so the first poem here is Ranch Retreats. Webb found a fine place first, south of town, called it Friday Mountain Ranch. And we spent lots of days there, he and Bedicek and I, grilling steaks, drinking beer and whiskey, talking on into the starry dark. Even got Betty a full year's leave to write his book there, and he turned time into words, as happy as a rattler in cactus. Whetted my appetite, and not long after that, I bought a spread out west of town called it Cherry Springs Ranch, a place with some cattle and a house for books and a writing room. Then I took sick out there. Pneumonia, would have died if a neighbor hadn't found me, hauled me off to the hospital. Had to give it up, find something closer, and settle on Paisano. Not a real Texas ranch, maybe, but plenty for a hobble guy who loved these limestone hills, damn cedars and all, a sanctuary that gave me 5 more years. Ranch and Creek. You've been here 2 weeks now and ought to feel why I bought it. Takes 10 minutes from the gate at the main road to get to the house. That's close enough. Too bad the town just keeps coming this way. Like those mountains on the ridge just past where the sun comes up. You can see a bunch from the rise on the road, but at the house they're mostly hidden and too far to hear from. Still, an abomination. I surely liked the original house, but I know it was breaking down like an old horse that's seen too many winters. At least it wasn't torn down like so much else from my day, but modernized as you folks require now. I'm getting used to the limestone siding on the new part. Good Texas rock. You can still hear the creek, can't you, day and night. I wouldn't have a ranch without one, just a plain piece of land otherwise, one place as good as another. And I had Waller Creek singing to me at our place in town. I'll promise you one thing, if this creek ever dries up for good, I'll disappear too. Some of you may have noticed, if you've been out to Barton Springs, that there's a statue there. It was erected some years back, and it shows 3 men, Dobie, Bedicek, and Webb, who back in the, I think, 40s and into the 50s and so forth, used to like to spend a lot of time out at Barton Springs. And there was one particular rock out there that Bedicek was sort of sort of held forth there, and they used to, all three of them used to hang out there, and Dobie and Bedichek liked to jump in and swim around a bit when the heat was so significant, and but Webb apparently didn't care much for swimming, but he'd go out there and hang out with them. This is called, and then there's a rock out at the ranch that is sort of reminiscent of that rock, and so this is called Conversation Rock. Go out this front gate, down the road, just around the bend, and look for the live oak, wider than any door, and twisted about like an old man with arthritis. Turn right into the field of tall grass, and 40 yards in, you'll reach the creek bank, water 2, maybe 3 feet deep, and a tiered limestone table peeling the gurgling creek in two. Bedichek and I waded out a couple of times, sat there like we did on his rock at Barton Springs, and I may have sipped on a whiskey while he pontificated, but we'd gotten old by then, and he was gone a month later. They say the original Philosopher's Rock was swept away by flood back in the 60s, and now there's a statued rock, Betty, Webb, and me, in our bronze maturity, that folks can come and gawk at. I'd trade that eternity any day for an hour on the rock here at the ranch, soaking up the sun and listening to the creek tell its winding story. Dobie called the ranch Paisano Ranch, and Paisano really has multiple meanings. It's commonly a term that refers to a countryman, a fellow native, fellow citizen, and so forth. But it also can refer to the roadrunner, and that's although both terms I'm sure were significant to him. The roadrunner was an animal that he was very partial to, and it was his perhaps, well, I don't know about favorite animal. He loved horses very much, of course, but in terms of maybe wild animals, it was a kind of a special animal. And so this poem is called Totem. We were cut from the same cloth, the Paisano and I, both bound to the land, both with 2 toes aimed forward and 2 stuck firmly in the past. Bertha claimed my white hair stood up like a roadrunner's crest when I got wound up and feisty. Some wag back in the 40s taped a sketch to my office door, a bold Paisano with a boot against a rattlesnake's neck, pecking out the brains of a head labeled UT Regent. Well, I might have wished then I could be that ruthless, but it sure did give me a belly laugh. I've long admired that brazen bird, smart, tough, and faster on 2 legs than any cowman can go except on horseback. Good to have a totem that can leave this earth on short flights of fancy, but prefers the feel of common dirt between its toes. Berditsa. So you found that tool up on the mantle, on its side, and you're wondering what the devil it could be. Weighs 5 pounds if I remember right. Stand it up and it looks like a bow-legged cowboy, arms spread out wide to stop a steer maybe. Well, that steer would have met that tool already. Same with a wether. We'd use it in the spring or late fall on the bull calves and ram lambs. Get them before they got too big. Clamp them above the testicles, pull the handle shut, crush the sperm cords in the scrotum. Done right, not a drop of blood. Can't say they were happy about it. But you can't have pastures full of mean bulls and ornery rams. I've heard tell it works on humans too. No experience there. Just a word of caution, don't give the missus any cause for grievance. As I mentioned, Dobie died in '64. A few years later, I think it was in 1968, Larry McMurtry published a collection of essays called In a Narrow Grave. At that point, he already had several successful novels, and was being proclaimed, Texas's for young outstanding writer, novelist, and so on. And in his in his essays, he commented on some of his predecessors, including Dobie, and I'm just going to briefly quote. This is he did criticize much of Dobie's work and said that it was largely repetitious, poorly organized, and for the most part dull. Okay, so I think he was sort of feeling his oats and making his mark and all of those sorts of things. At any rate, this poem is called "The Novelist and the Storyteller." I'll give McMurtry credit for what he's done with all those novels. He's a real novelist, knows how to get inside his men and women, create a world that pulls the reader in and on like a long winter dream. Hell, I knew he was a writer when he reviewed Henry Miller in college. His pot shots at me were pretty easy to get off after I was gone, and some of his bullets were on the mark. I found my anecdotage could get tedious too, but I wasn't a novelist. I was a storyteller, taking tales from far and near, open campfire or some old cowboy's living room, and shaping them on the page, giving them as much of the grit and texture of the brush country or West Texas desert as I could. Yarns and folk tales and ghost stories, gifts received and passed on. And maybe old Larry, older now than I ever was, owes me a small thanks for pointing toward the Longhorns and Mustangs and turning him loose. It happens that Dobie was born on September 26, 1888, so just a few days ago was his 130th birthday. There was another famous writer, more famous writer nationally and further worldwide reputation than Dobie was born on that day. And this poem is about these two writers who shared the birthday. It's called T.S. Eliot and Me. Born the same year, the very same day, but never mistaken for literary twins. While raised in the same big pasture, drinking from the same wide trough, he became an English shorthorn bull. I turned into an ornery longhorn. Critics tried to brand us early on, not give us the space we needed to roam around. He, the high priest of modernism, with his wasteland, spineless Prufrock, murdered archbishop, then the comical cats, his conversion to Anglican spots. I, the southwestern regional guy, cowmen and frontier wisdom, true stories, yarns of legend and fable, tales of coyotes and mustangs, my conversion to liberal bellowing. The wartime stay in Eliot's England deepened my ties to Wordsworth and Sir Walter Scott. I'll stick with the 19th century and also claim Coleridge and Conrad. He's welcome to stake out the others, celebrate Dante, Donne, and Dryden, as long as I can keep an eye out for Hamlet's ghost. Well, in November of 2016, while I was at the ranch, we had a national election. And the ghost was aware of this as well. And this is a comment that, this is what he had to say after the election. There's a reference in here to a man who was a governor of Texas in the late 30s and early 40s, a fellow named W. Lee O'Donnell, W. Lee O'Daniel, who was called Pappy. That was his nickname, Pappy O'Daniel. He was a radio personality and a radio celebrity, I guess you could say. No TV back then, but he promoted a flower company and had a country and western band called the Light Crust Doughboys, and he parlayed all that into a political run, and that was successful. So Dobie ends up referring to him through this poem. It's called Election. So last night, enough states came through for that con artist from New York City, the one who has to spangle his name on everything just so he can remember who he is. Sounds like he's the worst. He's worse than the brashest Texas braggarts I ever knew, and that covers lots of ground. Reminds me of that jackass who peddled biscuits and songs from El Paso to Texarkana back in the 30s. Steeped in his celebrity, Pappy O'Daniel two-stepped into the state capitol, but it didn't take long to tell his flower was weevil infested, even if many Texans still bought the goods, voted as if old Pappy was the right man. Thanks to his regents, Homer Rainey got fired, and then I got put out to pasture. Time takes care of fools, as it did for him in the 50s, and I don't doubt that this latest brand of trumpet will find itself discarded, too tarnished and dented to salvage, when its tooting has worn thin and the audience has all gone home. A couple more poems. Cedar Fever. It may be December and cold now, and lots of the ranch is going dormant, but come over here and take a look at this cedar. See those rusty tips dressing up the shaggy limbs? Well, tell you what, here tomorrow or next week, one day real soon, thanks to the wet spring and wet months this fall, you'll be blessed with a fine mist of cedar pollen, and right across the creek valley, between the gate and that bluff, you'll see a haze, not from a fire or pollution, but mountain cedar. Belichick used to get my goat this time of year saying, "That's incorrect, Dobie. You mean ash juniper, not mountain cedar." And I'd say, "Hell, Dobie, give it any name you want, it's still plain evil." I had to leave town, turn my classes over to Bertha. It crippled me so. Best place was West Texas, out in the desert air, where I could grade papers, write a little on another book. One good thing about being dead, these damn trees can't torture me anymore. Mesquites. That sculpture on the table inside was made by my good friend Modi Boatwright, carved out of hard mesquite, 7 triangles planed and fitted to show off a roadrunner's singular physique, sharpened beak, foot-long tail. Boatwright picked the right wood to charm me with, knew how it made a paisano come alive. I grew up with mesquites, learned to respect their thorns, their long tap roots that somehow found water even in arid brush country. In a pinch, the cattle would eat their pods, and their pale green leaves in the early spring against a blue sky was a thing of beauty. My one disappointment out here was that this limestone earth likes cedars better than mesquites. When it's light, look to the west, and you'll see the 2 mesquites I planted just inside the fence to remind me where I came from. Wish they planted one beside me in the cemetery when they buried my bones in a fancy box. Dobie's buried at the state cemetery here in Austin. And the last poem I'll read is called Endings. Barbed wire and the railroad brought a halt to trail drives from Texas to the Midwest by the time I came along, late 1880s. Family ranching was a tough go even then, and I knew I'd end up better writing about the life than living it, as much as I admired the ones who did. Glad I got so many stories back then. People these days don't do much gallery talking, TV full of babble, computers stimulating folks to jump like crazed grasshoppers from one thing to another. Don't even want to think about emails, texts, tweets. So maybe this ranch isn't really a ranch, but a place where stories can be found. Same can be true in cities, any place where people take time to listen to what their lives can tell them, then tell others, even if it's only one person on a dark night, caught up in the magic of the tale, but knowing it will have to end. Thank you.